Welcome to Grail Country. This stream was sort of put together somewhat impromptu. A few days ago, or actually like last week, um, my friend Paul Axton, who I recently introduced to the channel, uh, wrote a piece in reaction to David Bentley Hart's Valentine's Day uh, kind of confessional about the irreligious character of his own Christianity. And I was really kind of surprised at Paul's reaction to what David had to say in that piece. And Brian and I kind of had a little bit of discussion about it, and he wanted to come on. And Paul actually did a podcast with a couple other folks yesterday, and Brian and I were not available, but Brian still wanted to talk about it. So I said, "Oh, let's do it." And so here we are. So Brian, first of all, what did you think of David's original piece, and what was your assessment of it? And then what did you think of Paul's response? And then we can kind of, I think where we kind of wanted to go with the conversation, I sensed as we were talking about it, is to maybe explore this idea of irreligious Christianity a little further, maybe beyond even what Hart meant in his confessional, or what Paul was reacting to.
That is true, and that may make sense, a little bit of sense about what I'm about to say, which is I didn't read what David Bentley Hart wrote.
Oh, okay. So you only read Paul's reaction. Okay.
And I'm kind of familiar with David Bentley Hart. I've not been super, I read his pages on his Substack for a year or so and had a good friend who had introduced me to him, but mostly just through reading in Paul's classes and talking about his thoughts and ideas. And wow, I was a little bit shocked to hear about it through Paul's blog. But as I read it, I saw comments that were in critique of what Paul was saying and his take on it and his value, the value that he had put on it.
Yeah, let me speak to that side really quickly. Yeah. I have nothing but respect for Paul. I think he's a good guy. He's a smart guy. And I don't know if he didn't have his coffee that morning when he read what David wrote or what exactly happened, but I don't actually recognize anything that David wrote in Paul's response. Like, not what I don't really see any in none of what Paul saw do I actually see. And he quotes David's own writings in the piece, yes, but a lot of what he says actually isn't sourced from that particular piece. And I think it really was just what he called it, which is a confessional. Like, David was very clear about the fact that he didn't think that there was anything laudable about his natural lack of religious temperament. But that's just simply how he's wired. And he was also very clear that despite that irreligious temperament, he remains a Christian because he simply believes it's true. Not ever with any, doubts or reservations or questions, of course, but really believes. And that's why he's a Christian. And the thing that seems to have got kind of stuck in the craw for Paul is David's wanting to back away from Christian identity. But David said that, as I read the piece, David said that in service of a connection to something deeper than mere Christian identity, which he was rightly seeing as kind of a cultural artifact, which is something I was very surprised, knowing Paul and knowing the way Paul's thinking kind of leans. I was surprised that would be something that he would find objectionable. So make sure I'm very confident that I'm reading David properly, but you know Paul even better than I do, and have known him longer than I have. Am
Yeah.
I reading Paul correctly?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's what I wanted to kind of come on and talk about, and throw in some broader ideas that kind of counterbalance the way Paul may sound to most readers who are just getting introduced to him by this piece, especially, is his reading of David Bentley Hart. For ever since I've been taking Forging Plowshares classes with Forging Plowshares, it's just slightly, just very different from each other, the two, and my.
What do you think is so? Yeah. What do you think? Where is the difference? Because on the one hand, like they're both Christian, they both lean Christian anarchist in their politics. Although David is not a pacifist, which is strange because usually being a Christian anarchist and being a pacifist go hand in hand. But David has repeatedly said that he's not a pacifist. I don't. That might have something to do with his familial history of military service. Not sure. You'd have to ask David that, but Paul definitely is a pacifist. But they're both universalists. They both kind of find the same sorts of theology objectionable.
Yeah, that's what I'm pointing to, is the fact that they have a lot of things in common, but the difference is something that I've been trying to trace over, the years. And I haven't cared so much myself. I know David Bentley
Right.
Hart is a huge figure and interested in have utmost respect. And I just haven't done any deep dives with him to read and kind of follow what the nuances are and what the differences would be between him and Paul Axton, who I have, really been followed closely for these several years. But let me just say that your reading of Paul is one of the things I'd like to try to help, and it was going to take
Okay.
some back and forth, because back when it was months ago, and maybe it was probably 6 months ago, Paul wrote something about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And that was something that I felt was very a good conversation starter between Forging Plowshares and this little corner.
Yeah.
And Mike could bring some good, fertile conversation about, and it kind of got shut down, not by you, of course, but just
Right.
in putting it out there, it seemed like it was not going to get the attention. But you did have some critiques of that. And see, I'm pretty familiar with Jordan Peterson and very familiar with Paul. And I read what Paul wrote, and I could see how what he was saying was not fully appreciative of Jordan Peterson, because he didn't know much about him. He really only took his
Right.
critique from one document, the one that was part of the ARC conference last year. He wrote with Jonathan Peugeot, where they were talking about, I guess, was it subsidiary? Whatever it was. It was a full account, I think, of the perspective that Paul was critiquing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my main concern with kind of a foundation for civilizational angles on Christianity within TLC, and something that is an at-root critique of Jordan Peterson that Paul is good at getting at.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have to talk about that one, of course, maybe another time. But
well, no, I didn't think there was no, like, in terms of the part of his critique of Peterson that was a critique of his embrace of a kind of cultural or civilizational Christianity. I don't disagree with that part. And in fact, I mean, I don't know if you saw I had a panel on
I did
discussion
go back and watch that.
on Kingsnorth's Erasmus lecture. I mean, and I'm a Christian anarchist, so that wasn't a part of it. All I was trying to say to Paul is that there's also more to him than just that.
Yeah.
And that actually, if you pay attention to him over time, yes, he definitely is into the importance of this cultural or civilizational Christianity, but he is also a person who is going through his own journey as it relates to dealing with the reality. So I think that Jordan is actually closer. It's funny because Jordan embraces the civilizational Christianity that David Bentley Hart clearly rejects, which is why it was so weird, right? So David agrees about this. That's actually what he's reacting against a lot in the piece. And Paul doesn't like it either. And so it was a strange place for him to direct his fire on that. Now Jordan embraces it and is having a very hard time on the very thing that is what David clings to.
Yeah.
Like the fact of the resurrection of Christ is the thing that keeps David Bentley Hart a Christian. And he's very open about that in this piece. Since you didn't read it, let me just kind of share a little bit. I have it open. Yeah, right here. I have come to accept that I'm a thoroughly secular man who happens to believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. So the thing that is a stumbling block for Jordan Peterson is the anchor of David's faith.
Yeah. And Paul Axton is looking at both of them and making a critique not with David Bentley Hart, but with Jordan Peterson. It was a very, a very recent introduction he had probably through me or through us about what Jordan Peterson had been saying. And I sent him the document that was published for ARC. And that was mainly what he was critiquing.
Right.
And he's written one since, I think, about Jordan Peterson too. But he's much more familiar with David Bentley Hart.
Yeah.
Of course.
By the way, that's all. David despises Jordan. So that's something.
I know this. I know. I recognize.
Like, there's
me as I'm just hearing about.
And David. Here, I'm just the guy that likes them all.
Yeah, I like that about you. And I do too. I mean, I want to hear and listen, and probably wouldn't jump to the same. Is one thing I like about Paul Axton is he goes straight to some very critical issues and puts a good.
Well, also the go straight to that's the thing. So that's actually there's a comment that's a common link there, and this is actually maybe what I respect about all three men. Right, is that none of the three of them have any inclination to suffer fools.
Yeah,
they're gonna call it as they see it, and they're gonna speak the truth as plainly as they can in accordance with the way they see it.
Yeah, and then your reading of Paul. And that makes sense why you kind of familiar with all three of them, probably less with Paul out of the three.
Yeah, probably less with Paul.
Recently.
Yeah.
But when you see Paul's critique of either one of them, you see some of the holes where light gets through or, escapes or whatever that you would like to comment on to say, yes, but here's more of what the flavor I see when I'm, reading Jordan Peterson or David Bentley Hart. So I just, as soon as I read Paul's piece about David Bentley Hart's, what is it called? Is it a confession? I guess.
He calls the title of it is. He called it. Let me go up to the top I want to make sure I get it right. Confessions of an Irreligious Christian. Mm-hmm. And so and the subtitle is "Or Christ Plays in 10,000 Places."
And
And
it was put out on Valentine's Day. So
yeah,
what do you see as the significance of this for his readership and for those who really admire and listen to him a lot? I mean, what do you think the impact is, or the maybe the motivation, or maybe even like the actual value of it, or what was going on there with it?
I think he was answering a question that he gets asked a lot, and to people who had pressured him for an answer nicely enough that he felt obligated to give one. And so he gave an account of where his faith is, and it was a very honest and self-critical account.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he was not suggesting that the way he is the best way to be. He was just being very honest about that being his makeup and temperament, and and it's David, so of course it's beautifully written. Um, uh, and I mean, he says some things that are challenging to some people. Like, I mean, part of for part of the context here is that he's been Orthodox for a long time now, and the current trajectory of Orthodoxy in the United States is very much in a direction of this kind of like
Yeah.
full-throated embrace of this kind of civilizational Christianity.
I remember him saying in one of his Substack posts was, yeah, Orthodoxy is going to get ruined. That's what about the sort of influx of so many Americans, I guess is what
right.
he was saying, in the
Well,
West.
so here's the thing, though. He doesn't like in here. He talks about he's very frank about the difficulties in maintaining a prayer life that he faces. He talks about how the beauty of the liturgy, has lost its magic for him, and that even the sacrament is doesn't thrill him in the way that maybe it once did. But he's still and there's other context there that's needed too, is that David has been suffering a great deal, like physically, lately. He's been in an immense deal of physical pain, and he's in a place of immense suffering. So one of the things that Paul takes him to task for in the piece is that he talks about how, though he has this faith in the resurrection of Christ, he has no imagination for the possibility of his own resurrection, but also no fear of death, which for someone who is currently living in pain, the idea of I think one of the ways he expresses it is the idea of taking a long nap, right?
Yeah.
It's actually quite appealing. And he talks about how he actually turns that in a way, he actually turns his own state there in a way against the atheists, and he points out how the idea that his faith is simply a crutch against the fear of his own demise can't possibly apply to him because he has no such fear, and yet he believes. There's to me there was a deep beauty there. There was something almost Kierkegaardian about David's approach to his faith in this piece. To me, is in fact very Kierkegaardian, because Kierkegaard was no fan of civilizational Christianity either.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, it's maybe a good time to bring up what my initial thought was. As I read what Paul wrote about David Bentley Hart, is because it seemed like what some people didn't like was the move that David Bentley Hart made, and Paul being somewhat critical of it.
mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I remember, and then here's a post from 21. Can you read that? Is it backwards? I don't know. Religionless Christianity, where Paul on Axton wrote this on 9/9/21, and it's on his blog still. You can look it up. but I've not been able to get that out of my head for the longest time. And it's basically about Bonhoeffer's,
Right.
statement about maybe at
Now,
this point.
David quite explicitly says, and just since you brought that up, I'll mention it because David explicitly says in the essay near the beginning that when he talks about his irreligious faith, he's not talking about anything like Bonhoeffer's
Mhm.
irreligious Christianity, which he then lauds, but he says that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
But the reason he says that's what I'm not what I'm talking about isn't to critique Bonhoeffer. It's very clear from when he writes that he actually sees Bonhoeffer's vision as a good one.
Yeah.
He's just not wanting to claim credit for something that doesn't actually belong to him because that's not the state he's in.
Yes, and if he said that, I just want to say it's also not unrelated. I think there is probably a thread, even if it's Paul Axton speaking to both things. Um, but that's why I was interested in it, is to kind of bring an awareness for where Paul may be coming from, and he can clear this up. It takes a lot of time to
Paul's,
get.
just to be clear to the entire audience, I still like Paul a great deal. Paul is still a friend. I still want Paul's little world over at Forging Plowshares and TLC to come into greater and greater contact with each other. All of those things are still things I want. I just think Paul misread David's intentions
Mm.
in writing this particular piece.
Well, I certainly don't have a critique of your critique, since I didn't read one of the
Let me
documents.
share. Actually, okay, just to give you a little bit of context, let me share for you so you can get a flavor for it. Let me share to you the conclusion here. All that said, I'm not going to make any more vigorous attempts to justify my condition, let alone glamorize it. I am sure that those who are borne up by corporate worship, prayer gatherings, and daily offices enjoy richer and stabler spiritual lives than mine. I would never recommend that anyone imitate my style of faith or wish anyone else to be confined within my emotional and spiritual limitations. But again, I have been asked so often about these things that it seemed at last somehow dishonest to keep it all to myself any longer. As, however, the confessional mode is still alien to me, I had best stop here with no intention of ever returning to the subject, except perhaps by accident. I will simply close by asking that you pray for me if you are disposed to do so. And happy St. Valentine's Day.
Mm. Yeah. Well, it does sound mostly just about honesty, and
Yeah,
consistent with what Paul was writing about him, is that David being honest about it and sharing this is a good thing, I would think. And I think Paul would
yeah, it
say
is a good
that
thing.
this is in and of itself, the sharing is not bad. It is good to be honest, of course. But I think Paul's main point was, from what he knew about David's, I guess, theology and method, and whatever it is that he differs from him on, this appeared to be something that was actually consistent. I was going to say
Right.
predictable, but not really predictable. It was just.
Yeah, I suspect that Paul hasn't read much of his works other than the theological writings, because David is not. I mean, you can't. No one can read something like Roland and Moonlight and think that David is nothing but a syllogism machine who spits out super rational arguments. And I
Hmm.
don't like, and I know I know Paul has read Doors of the Sea, and Doors of the Sea is not like that. Is not like that at all. It's a that that book relies on its moral force and aesthetic sensibility to carry the argument more than logic It really does. Not that it's not entirely logical. And you know, I mean, David has a great facility with making really sound logical arguments. That's not really a bad thing. But he's not limited to only thinking that way. Not remotely. So, yeah, that's
Paul opened it up by saying that he's had similar doubts, or does have similar doubts, and it's just you know, there's some sympathies there, and I guess that's what I wanted to see if you and I could throw around a little bit is, what does it look like for us to doubt, and would we ever, or do we think we would ever remove the name Christian, you know?
Right. Yeah. So this, yeah, yeah. Then it comes up like, well, David is pretty clear in like, so David is not talking about irreligious Christianity in any sense other than just describing his own temperament. He's just being honest about his own nature as like a thoroughly, he says early on, he's like I think I read that part where he says he's a thoroughly secular person who happens to believe in the, you know, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Right. So that's really all he means. He's actually not making a critique of religion, even, which I probably would, you know. So I would go, you know, I might take that in a different direction. So like kind of like all the things that David talks about in here, I would probably maybe even promote. Okay, here's the thing. I would be less the faithful son than David is in this piece, because I would not have been able to resist the inclination to defend it as a good thing, because I have some similar kind of inclinations, but I don't even pretend they're a defect.
Right.
Although I don't find attendance at the liturgy at least at this point, I don't find attendance at the liturgy quite as what's the word, uninspiring as David does at this point. And you know, I mean, I wonder how much of that is related to his health. I don't know, and I pray for his speedy recovery.
Yeah.
But I don't think that, I think one can be full of the love of Christ without having any use for religion.
Yeah, and I think that the something about the statement he made that he's a thoroughly secular person. I've been toying with the idea that, you know, we don't have to have a metaphysical basis to believe.
Right.
It can be seen from more like a belief in a process that does not have the necessity of a dual, you know, world or realms type thing, where God is, I mean, if you take from a point of view that is experiential and biblical and consistent with an apocalyptic theology, we experience God as a human being in history whose life was written about, who we encounter in our own prayers and experience. So if we encounter a being in history, Jesus, because we had this concept of God, and Jesus is God. I mean, that's the heart of our faith. What does it mean to be secular? What does it mean to not have a Platonic sort of frame for an otherworldly existence that broke into ours? Rather, it's God as a being expressing God's self through Jesus Christ. And we don't know anything more about God than what we see Jesus said about himself and what we can.
Yeah, what does it what yeah, what like yeah, that's right. Because like if we're still wrestling with the full implication of the incarnation. What does it mean? What does it mean when God is not just a concept or a feeling or an idea, but is a living, breathing human being, and yeah, how does that change everything?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean for religion when God has entered the world?
And also what does it mean for reality and time, or the relationship between eternity and time? Because that you may think that gets you into a sort of, dual worlds, but I don't think it necessarily does. It takes the recognition that our experience of a person and our interpretation of him as the heart of God is communicated to us. And what do we mean by God besides everything that we can know through the man? And we just know that Jesus is.
Well, I would submit that the God that is a what and not a who it simply doesn't exist. That the atheists are right about that God.
Yeah. Well, it brings us to the question of religionless Christianity, because David Bentley Hart's, he may have used the word, but Paul definitely used the word irreligious Christianity, if that's what it is, or is it if it's a renouncing of Christian identity? There seems to be a valid, and Paul Axton wrote about it back in 21 in Bonhoeffer about sort of a coming of age of humanity in Western secularity.
That's one of the things that struck me about the piece that he wrote in reaction to David's. And by the way, I dropped the link in there if people want to join us at this point in the conversation. Cool. Now that we've kind of primed the pump a little bit, I'll drop it again in case people missed it. But one of the things that seemed to be his gravest concern is that David was discarding the importance of the role of the church.
Yeah.
But then again, I wonder what's Paul's conception of the church in order to say that, because if David's subtitle is Christ plays in 10,000 places, right? So it's like if Christ is Christ, then the intended extent of the church is the entire cosmos. So in what way are we giving up? In what way are we giving up on the church that is truly intended in failing to find inspiration in certain religious modes?
I myself can't imagine setting aside church or Christian identity. So that I should play my hand right there is, for myself, I can understand what Paul Axton is saying. And the two go together, for me, and I think for Paul. So yeah, I don't quite get that part of what David Bentley Hart is getting at or saying or expressing. I do understand, and it resonates with me, the question of do I need an afterlife to feel like this is worth it and that my faith is valid. And I know 1 Corinthians 15 says you do, it's kind of, it all depends on resurrection.
Right.
But, and I think that's where I land I think it's certainly where I land, because I'm not sure why, but it is. But I do have this, it resonates with me to hear him say, he could unresentfully cease upon the midnight without pain, knowing that afterward no one would bother me. David Bentley Hart writing that just annihilation, personal annihilation, doesn't sound like a negative thing or a loss.
Now, see, this is okay. This will be made for interesting conversation, because you're wired more like David in that regard. Me, no. There are not many people who love life and being alive more than this guy. Like I, as far as I'm concerned, y'all are lacking in imagination if you can't think of ways to entertain yourself, even in this glorious life, for a really long time. I don't know. I don't know if it would. I don't know if I would find it interesting. I think I would find it infinitely interesting, because I don't believe God's ever going to stop making people, and there are always new people, and therefore new mysteries to get to know. Because even a single person, you could spend your entire life exploring the mystery of a single person, and you would never ever have fully explored their depths. There's always something new to discover.
You're right. I mean, you may talk me into agreeing with you, and I'm not sold on it. I just, there's a part of me that does resonate with the idea or the experience maybe of going into death and being thankful for a finite life,
right?
And it not being a travesty, or it's not a horrifying.
Oh no, there is a long standing tradition of people even intellectually arguing for that. Like, I can remember when I was at Thomas Aquinas College, I can remember getting in an argument with my seminar instructor because I didn't think that the promise of immortality that was made to Odysseus was what was a curse. And I thought Odysseus actually gave up something real and meaningful. Hello, Sherry. It's so good to see you. Welcome.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, Sherry. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. I haven't read either pieces, but I have a lot of thoughts about the topic.
Sure. We're into that phase now, where it's kind of, we just use that as a springboard, which is why I called it religion. Which is why Religionless Christianity was the name of the stream, because David in his piece calls himself an irreligious Christian. Paul in his response talks about his conception of the church, and I wanted to. I don't think that the idea. I don't find that the concept of the church is in conflict with the idea of religionless Christianity. But I define those things in a particular way, though.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say religionless, I already don't see Christianity as a religion.
Right. Yeah.
So
I was doing wool while I was listening to you guys here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to keep going and listening, and
by all means.
It's easier for me to throw in a verbal comment than stop and type one in.
No,
but,
yeah.
One of the things
you have earned the right to hitchhike on the stream anytime you want.
I have been thinking a lot about two verses that just keep going back and forth in my mind. One of them arrived sometime in the fall this last year, and it was, "Unto us is born this day in the city of David a child." And it stops there. Like, I know there's more, but
Right.
but the emphasis was on that, right?
Mhm.
And then the other one was foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of God has nowhere to lay his head,
Mhm.
right? And somehow those two things are related in my mind. And I think they're also related to what you're talking about, Nate, with this religionless Christianity.
Well, you know, David's struggling with the same thing that, you know, Graham, he's really struggling with the same thing Graham was struggling with leading up
Yeah.
into the conference in the Pacific Northwest.
And that could simply be what an Orthodox deconstruction looks like.
Yeah, I think so.
You know what I'm saying? But I did say in the comments, I thought it was a bad idea for David Bentley Hart to write such a piece in the middle of such a painful health journey and the fact that Trump became the president.
You know, actually, I would have shared that concern, and then I read it, and he actually, the way he did it was quite admirable.
Okay.
It was very humble.
That might have been an assumption on my part.
It was one of the most moving and humble things I've ever seen from him. It was beautiful. In fact, when I responded, I subscribed, and when I responded to the comments, all I said was, "Thank you, beautiful David."
Yeah.
That was my. What else could I say?
Well, it's from the heart.
The man's suffering. He's talking very honestly about something that he is acknowledging is a shortcoming, and then he solicits at the end. He's soliciting prayers. So.
And the other thing I thought about in regards to David Bentley Hart is the fact that he's been trying to make nuanced arguments without rocking any real boats about universalist salvation and a kind of a perennialism, really, right?
Yeah. Well, he hasn't really avoided rocking boats.
I mean, you know him better.
He's rocked the heck out of those boats.
So anyway, I just thought I'd add those, and I'll listen in, and if I have something to say,
Hi, welcome, Reese. Did you have anything that you wanted to add or a question you wanted to ask?
Howdy. Yeah, this is well, I've looked around Grail Country for a while. I like watching. Oh.
Have you got your tab open still?
Oh,
for
yes.
YouTube? Yeah.
But yeah, no worries. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have very little experience with streaming, but you hear me?
Yeah. I hear you.
Well, like I said, I've looked around Grail Country a lot. This is the first time I've hopped on one of these. I like a lot of what you do. But the whole religionless Christianity thing is something I've thought a lot about in the last year or so, and nowhere near as deep as you guys, and generally not very positive. But I just got here recently, so maybe I already talked about this, but I wanted to see if how I've thought about these terms is the assumption that you're working with, because there's religionless Christianity without institutions or suspicion towards coercion or dogma generally, but a lot of the religionless Christianity, or what would go under that title that I've been exposed to, is like the postmodern theology.
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah. That's not what I have in mind at all.
No.
Yeah, Caputo Rollins, because I see on one hand you've got a suspicion of institutions, on the other hand you've got the suspicion of
Oops.
Looks like we lost Reese. Oh, there we go. We got you back. We lost you for a second there.
Yeah, everything I've seen from you guys isn't the anti-metaphysical stuff. I know that's not your opinion, but the thing that kind of bothers me, maybe this is just personal, just some personal insecurity or whatever, but generally, I can't get out of my mind a sort of slippery slope
Mhm.
between the suspicion of institutions
Mhm.
and the suspicion of institutions and dogma and the loss of metaphysics.
Mhm.
Because on the some of the more extreme interpretations of, well, maybe not even that extreme, but some of the interpretations of an anti-religious or religionless Christianity, like I think there was just a book written by David Congdon, a Boltmanian, saying that Christianity definitions of Christianity should only be prescriptive. You should never try to identify an essence of Christianity. That's
Oops.
it. Always seems like you're underneath that. They're saying, in the end, Christianity could be anything you want it to be.
Mhm.
But when I hear that, I always think, well, if Christianity can be anything, then at the end of the day, it's nothing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And at least in my case, it doesn't interest me at all if that's going to be
Right.
the case.
Well, I think I will say this. It is. I think that Christ is one,
Mhm.
but the expression of Christ that happens in any individual instance of a life that is patterning itself after Christ, which is what I would say a Christian is
Yep.
going to be different. So it will be, but it will still partake in that unity. And in fact, it's the only way that we can have both unity and genuine difference is through identity with Christ. I think Jordan Daniel Wood in his book says something says that the hypothesis of Christ is the identity of identity and difference. Right.
Yep.
And so I don't mean that when I say that, I don't mean that people should stop going to church, because going to church and participating in the sacraments are all completely valid expressions of that.
Mhm.
However, I'm also wacky enough to understand that there are people who are participating in the same unity for whom those forms have no appeal.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about that. This morning. I was thinking about, because I got a ride to our estuary last night with from a friend of mine, and this friend is he's an agnostic, completely secular agnostic friend, but he is an amazingly kind, generous, loving person who, and it's funny because during estuary he said something about being in a mixed marriage because his wife is Christian and very involved in her church, and he's this agnostic scientist, right? And he made a comment about not being a Christian, and I almost I chuckled, but I almost really laughed out loud hard, because my priest was there and my priest said, "Are you sure about that?" Right? And it's like, yeah, right. Because here's the thing, it's like, he's a person who I'm sure is participating in that unity unawares.
Yeah.
Right. And so he lacks the religion, but he's still participating in that same unity.
Well,
Yeah.
this is what's so great about the piece that David writes, is because David is very honest about, this is not the best way to be. This is just how I am. And nonetheless, despite that being the case, faith in Christ is still something that characterizes me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think all that's nothing I'd have a problem with. But what I'm getting at is in terms of self-identification as a Christian, or identifying someone else as a Christian, where do you draw the line? I'm looking at that in terms of propositional beliefs. And with institutions, yeah, there's lots of room to talk about it. I'm fully open to that. But when it comes to propositional beliefs, that gets drawn lines like that gets a lot more difficult when you don't have institutions. And at least, like I said, this kind of sounds slippery slope, but what do you do if, say, Christian atheism is one thing, but what do you do if, say, you run into someone who, I don't know, denies the historical existence of Jesus, but still self-identifies as a Christian? Because there are a few people like that. They're rare, but they do exist. And I think
there have been atheists who've been ordained clergy in certain churches, right? And I mean, ultimately, that's between that person and God. I mean, it's like, it's like, it depends on why they're making the identification. I definitely think it's a terrible idea for a church as an institution to ordain someone who doesn't even believe in God. That doesn't sound like a good idea. But that's kind of that's up to the churches themselves have to decide like what they want their confessional boundaries to be and what they want their enforced dogmas to be. But in terms of like whether that person is participating in the unity that I talked about would be entirely dependent upon what their reasons are for claiming that label Christian. Are they claiming that label Christian because it's culturally convenient and it gives them cultural cachet and power? Probably not likely. I mean, there are times in history where that may have been the case, right? Where you had people who were effectively atheists who were even maybe high-ranking members of the clergy who had their position, who kept that identity simply because it gave them access to power. But that's less likely to be the case in our age. So it depends on what your reasons. Maybe your doubts are so severe that you can't even claim faith, but somehow you just can't quit the church for some reason that is mysterious to you. I don't know. It really would depend. It would depend on what's going on inside that person, ultimately.
Self-identification. Sorry, were you saying something?
No, I'm just saying self-identification. Like this, you could people self-identification doesn't really amount to much at the end of the day, right? Because that's just what I say. That's what I say that I am. But if you want to really know who I am, then look at how I act and how I treat the people around me, especially how I treat the people who are lower than me within the hierarchical structures of nature.
Yeah, I mean, self-identification is one thing, but obviously Christianity, it's a community as well. It matters if it can cause problems, but it matters if other Christians recognize you as a Christian or not. So if you get into areas like Christian atheism or the denial of what for most Christians throughout history have considered key dogmas, where you run into a problem.
Well, this is why sola scriptura is really the dawn of modernism, right?
Yeah.
Because and this is where it's like, I mean, this is where we get into like considering like how far does the extent of the damage go for what individualism and modernism have wrought in our culture. But then again, at the same time, what was it about tradition that caused it to be overthrown in the first place, because it was a Christian impulse that resulted in it was a Christian impulse that resulted in the Reformation and the overthrow of tradition as well. So
Neat.
it's yeah. Go ahead.
In our Lives of the Saints episode last week, or last Tuesday, is that yesterday? So I don't keep track of the days. But Eugene was there, and we were talking about God, serving God and mammon. And he pointed out that the word for mammon actually means in Syrian, or Aramaic, I guess that is, trust.
Really?
Well, no, sorry. The word for serving it means trust.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, who do you trust, God or mammon? Right?
Gotcha.
And as you guys were talking, I was thinking about, because essentially what you're wrestling with, I think, is what's happening when a Christian is deconstructing. And I would say even an agnostic North American is a Christian who's deconstructing, because they are swimming in those waters, right?
Mm-hmm.
As much as they hate to admit it. That was that whole Sam Harris, Sam, you're a Christian kind of argument.
Right. Yeah.
There's something about trust, I think, that happens to a person, because you get deconstruction in all kinds of Christian denominations. You even get it in, there are Muslims that deconstruct, there are Jews who deconstruct and switch, and, and so what is it about the human psyche that allows a person to do something like that, if it is what we would understand to be something, something divine like faith, right? Isn't that something that God graces to us? It's a gift from God. So how does that falter and stumble and fail? What's going on? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that has something to do with trust, because when trust is broken, a person feels betrayed, and then they don't know anymore if anything is true, right? And that's a very personal journey that people have to take. And
because
you never know you never know what it is that broke their trust. And I'm thinking specifically of my son in this regard. Like, he went through a very traumatic time in his life, and he went to a pastor, fully trusting the pastor, and the pastor didn't fulfill that trust. He didn't betray him necessarily, but he betrayed him propositionally. Mm-hmm. He gave him a Sunday school answer, mm-hmm. which felt like a slap in the face to my son. Okay.
Right.
And so, and that for him, that was the impetus to turn and walk away, Anyway, I'm just thinking out loud. That's all. I just wanted to throw that in the mix, because what Eugene said the other day, when he said that word serve means trust, I thought, wow, that really opens up that verse. Who are you going to trust, God or mammon? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a breakdown of trust. And I mean, that is a totally horizontal, like, human interaction problem, right? Like, we disappoint each other all the time. And so the question for me, and this is a question I had to ask myself, Nate, on my own journey, because I was like in the wilderness for a long time. And it was, what do I do when someone betrays the trust that I've put into them, whether it be a hierarch or a fellow parishioner, or, whatever, right? Like, does that essentially change my faith in God? And if it does, then how much faith do I actually have?
Well, I mean, we can think about what happens when we lose trust in a person.
Yeah. And it's not dissimilar, it's a long road back, I think, to, and here's the other thing about trust that I learned in my own personal journey. Trust has to be given. It can't be earned. Okay.
Right.
That's really difficult. So
Yeah.
maybe you guys can riff on that.
Right, because I mean, you can certainly act in a way that's trustworthy, but you can't actually. It's never something that you can that you can have. That you can demand. It has to be.
Well, here's a little short
by its nature.
example. Yeah, example to just show you how true this is. It was during like I was separated from my husband for a lengthy period of time, and I was in counseling, and the counselor said to me, it was a psychologist, he said to me, "You realize that trust has to be given." And my reaction was, that's never happening. And he said, "Well, it can't be earned." And then I walked away from that session, and I thought, oh, what was that in me that reacted? It was protecting. I was protecting myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm protecting myself,
then you're not trusting.
Well, I'm not giving trust. So here's the deal. My husband, he could dance and sing and build me a mansion and buy me nice clothes and be faithful and kind and, but if I don't give him my trust, he never has it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're hitting right on the head of something that's in this whole conversation that is a good anchor, Sherry, because trust, and I'm not familiar with that, with that passage or the word used for serve, but I know in general faith in Scripture, I come back to this often. Faith is trust, and faith is also another dimension to it. I mean, belief, that's the word.
Yeah.
But also rest. Like, where do you rest yourself, your identity, your whole person? Where do you find comforting, assurance about life and about all things? And so another way to ask it is, what is your foundation? What is
well, I think that's a good point. Like, let's turn back again to try to fairly characterize what David wrote here, because what was the one thing that David was still clinging to in that piece?
Resurrection.
Nothing about him. There was nothing about him that he was still clinging to, but he said, I know that this man, this Jesus of Nazareth, rose from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that was until you started talking to an hour ago, Nate, about it. Obviously, I didn't read it, but that's good to hear. I mean, I think there's something there that really resonates.
Yeah, and not so much for me, honestly, because I believe it. I believe it. I believe the evidence for it is strong, and I believe it. But it's not the first thing I turn to.
What, the resurrection?
No, the resurrection. When I'm struggling, it's not the first thing I turn to.
What are we saying when we say that Jesus' resurrection is our foundation, or it's the place where we rest? There's a phrase in Hebrews that says the power of an indestructible life. And resurrection comes from Jesus possessing life from this internal well, his Father, the source, and in his nature, but also a very concrete existence for him was a life that is greater than what Adam possessed. So an indestructible life, not corrupted, tempted in every ways that we are, fully human. That identity is the heart of our faith. It's the heart of the institution. It's the heart of our own identity if we claim Christianity. It's the heart of what we mean by believe as a Christian. So where do you rest and what is the actual foundation? We know it's his person. It's the person of Jesus. It's not abstract ideas about him. It's not even creeds as propositions. It's a person who has an identity. Our identity and our rest is found when we put it all on him. So that makes it all personal. And it is interesting question about David Bentley Hart's piece is what exactly he's doing and what exactly it means, because I can imagine dropping the name Christian myself in order to sort of separate myself from the religion.
Okay.
And not from the church necessarily, but
Yeah.
you get the nuance there. It's like the church is where 2 or 3 are gathered in the name of this man. That's
right.
my
But
assumption.
I don't think anything about what David wrote contradicts that notion of the church at all.
Good.
That's
Yeah,
what,
that's my curiosity.
and that's why I was surprised that, like, Paul in his response, that like the primary thing that he seemed to be concerned that David was doing was to lose the role of the importance of the church. And also, I mean, also there was, like, he accused David of a certain Orientalism, which is, I think, is a true in his aesthetic taste, but it's definitely not true of his. I mean, he uses Vedanta as a tool in some of his theological writings, but he's unambiguously Christian in his thinking at the end of the day.
Well, here's a question. When I see the title Religionless Christianity, my first thought, like when I saw this posted, Nate, my first thought was, oh, are they going to talk about asceticism? Because my patron saint is Saint Seraphim of Sarov. And for many, many years, he lived in the woods in a cabin. He wasn't a priest. Neither was Saint Herman of Alaska, by the way, was not a priest, right? And I was, I relate to that because of my own journey. And I thought to myself, was this their way of quasi, being part of the church, but not being part of the church? Because there are some people who just have that necessity. I don't think everybody does. And obviously not, like, if there's a place made for people, to do this, and then it's there, right? In these acts of asceticism. And I don't know how you feel about that. Like, because I've thought about it. I've thought about Saint Seraphim a lot, and thought, oh, that's, this is interesting to me personally, because I didn't want to be part of an institution anymore, but my relationship with God seemed just to get deeper and more real all the time. The more time I spent in the wilderness, the more mystical, deepening experience I had with God. And I came up against a lot of criticism about not being part of a community and so on. And I'm still wrestling with all those ideas, right?
I ought to get off here in a minute, but that kind of comes back around to what I was saying. It's that you could have people who don't necessarily accept the label, but still identify with the institution and the propositions. You can have people who do accept the label and identify with those. But really the heart of what I was getting at earlier is, what do you do when you have people who reject what you and most others think the institution stands for, but more importantly, reject the propositions, but still claim the label?
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'll get off, but just to
thank you, Reese. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, just to quickly reiterate what I said earlier, to make sure, my problem with the notion of religionless Christianity isn't so much with the anti-institutional part, it's with the anti-metaphysical part. But I think once you do start thinking anti-institutionally, it gets harder and harder
Yeah.
to define the anti-metaphysics out of Christianity. And if you get to a point in the anti-metaphysical part where they're saying any belief could plausibly be Christian, and once you don't have grounds to critique that, then Christianity means everything and nothing.
Mhm.
So
Right, which means that which is to attack its ability to exist as a community,
Right.
yeah,
right? Which is, by the way, that entire possibility is caused by individualism,
mhm.
Yeah.
which is caused by modernity, which I think ultimately is all entirely downstream from sola scriptura, because it introduces the idea that you can go and read the Bible on your own and make up your own mind about it.
I
Well,
gotta
then
go.
you've
Thanks
already
for having me.
ceased to think as part of a community the minute you do that. And so I think here's what I would say is that, well, a lot of things, and I mean, this is why the traditionalist conservative position has a lot going for it. Like, there's a lot of real force there, especially once you realize, especially if you don't take, modernity and individualism for granted, right? Which I think we're getting to the point where we're not just taking them for granted anymore. But I don't think we want to go back to a place where we lose the ability to think independently, because that is also good.
Well, yeah, it has to be balanced.
Right. So,
Right.
and that's the kind of conversation that I would like to try to have, because I actually see the merits in both approaches. It's important to have it is important to have people that are, full-fledged individuals that are capable of thinking for themselves. And nonetheless, people need to be embedded in functional communities, even the most rugged of rugged individualists. So we want to come up with something that neither absorbs identity entirely into a group or collective identity, with no differentiation for the individual, nor do we want to just have the chaos of nothing but private opinion of each individual person. So
I like this aspect of it, the question of individuals and each unique person's experience and honest reflection, and saying, this is where I am, this is what I'm thinking, and this is how I understand identity in Christ, or just saying, like, if someone is at the journey of faith and doubt is one way to say it.
Well, that's why I think, here's the thing. Here's where I would differ from the traditionalists, and I would go back to that idea I talked about earlier of this higher unity, but there being many different expressions and iterations that express that unity, that nonetheless have differentiation from one another. I think that's why the Trinity is so fundamentally important to understanding everything else about reality. But that is an entirely other conversation. I have so much more to say, but I actually have to go.
Oh no.
Because it's my sister. It's my younger, the older of my two younger sisters' birthday, and I need to go and help her celebrate her birthday. Sherry, if you want to keep the stream going, that's fine with me. But I
Brian,
do have to.
did you have to go, or did you want to talk more, or what are you thinking about?
I don't feel the need to talk more. I don't necessarily need to go, so I'm open, but I'm happy to to pick it up another time if y'all are. So I'm really thankful that you had it hosted, Nate, and that we were able to
we can
spin it out a little
maybe
bit.
we can talk again soon. Brian, it was good to have you on again. Sherry, it's always good to see you. It was such a pleasant surprise that you joined us.
Yeah. Thanks for
All
letting me join.
Well, let's just keep this one short and sweet.
Sounds
All
good.
right. Happy birthday
All right.
to your sister.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Bye, Nate. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
joining us.
Bye.